Welcome to Velina's talk on Finland's path to NATO membership. My guest is Professor Alexander Stubb, who is the director of the School of Transnational Governance as of May 1st, 2020. He has served as Prime Minister, Finance Minister, Foreign Minister, and also Trade and Europe Minister of Finland. He was also a member of the European Parliament and also National Parliament. He was the chairman of the Finnish National Coalition Party and also vice president of the European Investment Bank. Professor Stubb worked as an advisor at the Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Helsinki and Brussels, and in President Romano Prodi's team at the European Commission. He was also involved in the negotiation of the treaties of Amsterdam, Nice, and Lisbon. Now, this podcast is possible due to the kind cooperation with Bharat Varta, one of India's leading podcast producers on politics, policy, and society. Welcome to this talk, Professor Alexander Stubb. It's a great pleasure having you here.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
Let's start with, of course, the most urgent topic, and that is Russia's war against Ukraine. What is your assessment on the ongoing war and its impact on the European security architecture? What does the West need to do more efficiently, in your view, to further help Ukraine win the war?
Well, to start off with, this is probably a much more prolonged war than we expected in the beginning. And for some of us, it was actually surprised that it took place at all. I thought the playbook of Putin was the same that he had in Georgia in 2008 and the Crimean Peninsula in 2014, that he would essentially, after 4 or 5 different steps, stop with a frozen conflict of swords and a declaration of the recognition and independence of the area in question, so in this part, in Donetsk. So I was quite surprised when he went in on the 24th of February. How has the security architecture changed? Well, now that we are into 80 plus days in the war, I would say that it's changed permanently. It's a similar moment that we had with the end of the Cold War. And I think we're looking essentially at a divided Europe into two. On one side of the new Iron Curtain, you have an isolated, aggressive, revisionist, imperialist, totalitarian Russia, led by Vladimir Putin. And on the other side, you have 40 more or less democratic states who want to cooperate and abide by international law. How do we stop this war? I really don't know, and I struggle with that every day. I mean, I was chairman of the OSCE and foreign minister in 2008 when we got a ceasefire in 5 days in Georgia together with Bernard Kouchner. But I just don't see the end game on this. Can we do anything more? Not really. We have a full onslaught of sanctions, 5 waves from the European Union, more from the United States and from the UK. We're sending armaments, we're sending financial aid, we're helping out with refugees. So, you know, apart from getting involved ourselves, I don't think there's that much more that we can do. Keep on sending those arms, I guess, is a horrible thing to say if you look for peace, but that's the only reality we have on the ground.
Well, in fact, some argue, of course, that we could even push forward with energy sanctions. Obviously, gas embargo right now looks difficult in the short term, but at least achieving an agreement on oil embargo would certainly put a lot of pressure on the war machine in Russia.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you know, I think this is the kind of a thing where it's a careful balance with timing and then also what you'd fully isolated. So that means, you know, politically, economically, financially, sports, culture, transport, energy, you name it. And as far as energy is concerned, first we went for coal. Now the focus is on the oil embargo, which is held up a little bit because of Prime Minister Orban and Hungary, but that will eventually fall into place as well. And then the next step is, of course, a full gas embargo. For Finland, we don't need to do that because the Russians will actually cut off our gas today or tomorrow. 100% of our gas comes from Russia, but that's the bad news. But the good news is that it's only 5% of our energy portfolio, and it actually only goes to industry. So we can switch that off immediately and go to alternative grids and sources. Now, this is not the luxury or the strategy that some European states have had, so it'll be a little bit more problematic for them But yeah, I think, full isolation is the only way to go about this. There's no other alternative. This is a binary situation.
Now, obviously, one of the biggest miscalculations on the side of the Russian president was to disseminate this narrative, which basically collapsed, namely that he launched the war against Ukraine because of NATO expansion. Now, in fact, he has unleashed a new wave of NATO enlargement. Sweden and Finland joined the European Union together in 1995, and now they are also seeking to join NATO together in this historic moment for the alliance. Sweden has been neutral for more than 200 years, Finland since the end of the Second World War. Can NATO, in your view, integrate the two countries quickly? And what will be the most important steps towards NATO membership from Finland's perspective?
Yeah, perhaps two observations on this, and one is to tap onto what you started with. I actually don't believe that Putin attacked Ukraine because of NATO enlargement. It really had very little to do with it. This was an attack about values. Putin hates liberal democracy. He hates freedom, human rights, and fundamental rights. He is a conservative, authoritarian leader who believes that he can basically invade and annex anything that he wants, and the rest will follow. So that's why he did. The reason he attacked Ukraine was to Russify Ukraine. And of course, he achieved the exact opposite. He achieved the exact opposite in a lot of accounts. He wanted to split the European Union, never seen it more united. He wanted to drive a wedge into the Transatlantic Partnership. Well, it's back. He wanted to split NATO, back with a new purpose, not very far away from the one that it originally was founded on in 1949, mainly as a repellent at the time to the Soviet Union, now to Russia. And as a little bit of a bonus, he ended up basically forcing Finland and Sweden to join NATO. This would have never happened had he not attacked. So this, the 31st and 32nd member state of NATO, the ninth enlargement of NATO will be called Putin's enlargement, because that's what it was. Then as far as our membership is concerned, first of all, a little correction there. Finland was neutral during the Cold War, but we dropped the doctrine immediately after the Cold War. So we were neutral out of necessity, not our will, nor about ideology. That's why, we joined the EU and abided by the treaties, and that's why we went for a deep partnership with NATO as well. I mean, Sweden, you could argue, did the same thing. But be that as it may, our membership sort of path towards an intent to join has been very quick. Remember that the war started on the 24th, and we're now less than 3 months into the war, and Finland and Sweden have already basically said we're going in. Now, the procedure is not that complicated, but as we can see, there will be some political hurdles. One of them is Turkey. I'm quite sort of cool about it. I'm sure that through dialogue and conversation, we'll find a way. Secondly, I am slightly surprised at the moderate reaction of Russia. When Vladimir Putin and Sergei Lavrov say that Finnish and Swedish NATO membership is not a security threat to Russia, then you sort of have to think, well, okay, good, because we expected them to say, but they understand that, Finland and Sweden are not joining NATO to attack Russia. We just want to maximize our own security, and in light of what happened in Ukraine, I think it's a very justified decision. Of course, I hasten to add, I've been in favor of Finnish NATO membership since the early 1990s, so for the better part of 30 years. But it certainly, and just a final point, I was in a minority, 20% of the population, under 20% were in favor of NATO membership. Now we're talking 80% in favor. So, and that's in, 2.5 months. It's remarkable. And 188 votes in favor, 8 against in parliament. I mean, it's North Korean figures right there.
Well, in fact, Ukraine was also striving for a NATO membership, not because it wanted to attack Russia, but in reality, as we saw, Ukraine was reinvaded by Russia because it was not NATO member. In a sense, I agree with you that this kind of Russian narrative collapsed actually on February 24th, and now with Sweden and Finland striving for NATO membership, it I think totally collapsed, and all these propagators of the Russian narrative also in the West basically have no longer a backing for this argument. But Russia's defense minister Sergei Shoigu warned that Moscow would be taking adequate countermeasures in response to Finland and Sweden's NATO bid. He also was quoted saying that Moscow would respond to these threats by forming, for instance, 12 new units in its Western military district. What do you think would be this kind of countermeasures? What kind of hybrid warfare measures may Finland and to some extent Sweden face in this in the next few months while trying to join the alliance?
Well, sure. First of all, I wonder if they have 12 divisions around to move. I mean, it doesn't exactly look that they have a lot of them, nor are they doing a stellar job in Ukraine. Second observation, you have to understand that the language coming from Russian authorities will oscillate between aggressive and calm. So, one day we get, words of aggression, we'll move nuclear arms, or, we'll create new divisions, or there'll be a surprise or something like that. And the next day they say, well, we're not too concerned. So this is typical, Russian information war. And there'll be a lot of disinformation as well. So what kind of attacks? We don't expect anything conventional. I think, the Russian military is too busy on the Ukrainian front and doesn't want Finland, Sweden, or NATO involved in this. And so it's sort of self-defense for them not to do anything. But we do expect some hybrid activity, and that means two strands probably. One is cyber, the other one is information. So on the cyber side, we'll probably see attacks on our information technology or homepages. We saw that when Zelensky was speaking at the Finnish Parliament 4 weeks ago. The homepage of the defense ministry and the foreign ministry went down, and we're quite convinced that it wasn't Stockholm doing it. So, and we're also probably going to see some violation of Finnish airspace, which is a typical Russian method. They do it all the time, and it's not incompetence. I mean, they do it on purpose. So that happens. Then the information part is quite important. So you'll get three forms of disinformation. One is disinformation about Finland and Sweden in Russia. So, for instance, Astrid Lindgren, the author of Pippi Longstocking, or Ingvar Kamprad, the founder of IKEA, they are Nazis. This kind of disinformation in Russia. Secondly, we'll get disinformation about ourselves. So there'll be a lot of trolling going on. So far, it's been actually quite calm. Usually, they target people who are pro-NATO, like myself, but I haven't seen much on that front. And the Russian trolls have actually been, well, I'm not saying pacifistic, but quite passive. And then thirdly, and this is a more serious disinformation, is disinformation about Finnish and Swedish NATO membership in NATO allied countries. And that's sort of, malleable ground that some people who don't understand Finland or Sweden, they might hook on to some disinformation. So this type of stuff we'll be seeing in the next few weeks and months. But, so far, so good and quite calm, actually.
You also said the enlargement of NATO must be approved, of course, by all member states, so far 30 in the number, and also ratified by the parliaments. This could take up to a year usually, but actually the mood is that it will be an accelerated process. To what extent you already said you were rather calm on the Turkish reaction? Would you consider also a similar reaction towards Sweden's application? Would Turkey be an obstacle basically to NATO membership, given that both countries will seek to join the alliance together? And also, do you anticipate other possible obstacles, for instance, a slow ratification process, given the challenges the European Union members are facing right now with the security environment, of course?
Yeah, no, in normal circumstances, you would be probably looking at somewhere between 4 months to 12 months for ratification. But given the situation on the ground, I would expect this to go quite fast. I'd say, max 3 months. So we're talking August, September. But then, of course, you do have, political hurdles that you have to overcome because of domestic or the other political consideration in some of the member states. Right now, the focus is on Turkey. And, of course, I don't have the latest information because I'm not in government anymore, but I try to read the body language and see what leaders around the NATO table are saying and how they're reacting. So, for instance, I saw the press conference yesterday with Joe Biden and President Sauli Niinistö and Prime Minister Magdalena Andersson. And I'm sure if Joe Biden was unsure about the situation, he wouldn't be saying what he said yesterday. He basically said that he's quite confident that we can get this through. Now, the Finnish president, I think, made a very smart move. He said, we take Turkish security concerns very seriously. And that was a clear message to President Erdogan that, we'll try to find a solution. And I think President Erdogan, has 3 basic issues that he wants to deal with. Number one is the issue of, Kurds and PKK and the way in which that sort of terrorist organization is treated in the Nordic countries. And I guess there the issue is a little bit more, if I may, with Sweden than with Finland, to be absolutely honest about it. Secondly, there's an issue of arms embargo, which was imposed, I think, 2019 or 2020 by Finland and Sweden on Turkey. I don't recall what it was linked to, perhaps a war in Syria or whatever, but something that, will be part of the conversation. But the third and probably the most important one is linked to F-35s or the service of F-16s. So this is an American-Turkish issue, because Turkey bought some defense missiles from Russia, S-400s, a while back, and that's when the US decided to freeze the F-35s. I also looked at some of the statements coming from the press conference of the foreign minister of the US and the foreign minister of Turkey, and there, the language seemed quite sort of, we're trying to find a solution, let's take some concrete steps. Just a final point on this. I was a young civil servant at the European Council in Helsinki. I was actually a deputy Antici, which meant that I took the notes. Finland was the country that opened in its presidency the door for Turkish accession negotiations to the EU. I was foreign minister when Foreign Minister Ahmet Davutoglu and myself established the Friends of Peace Mediation Group in the UN. So Finland and Turkey, we have not had a bad relationship, and in that sense, I expect Turkey to help us as well.
Yes, and I agree with you that probably in the end it will be a kind of serious conversation between the United States and Turkey, given some of the tensions, as you outlined, with F-35, but also S-400, the Russian air defense system, where I suppose that the Turkish president will try to also gain some leverage.
Exactly.
And you were also right. I just checked on the embargo for our audience that it was in 2019. But obviously it's not personal, rather than actually it is also about the most recent developments in the Turkish-American relationship, where, as you rightly pointed out, in the end, they will certainly, I hope, agree, given the precarious situation.
Yeah.
And from a Turkish point of view, very strong position in the Black Sea by Russia is certainly bad news, which is why.
And the thing is, Finnish and Swedish NATO membership will strengthen security in the Baltic Sea region, will strengthen security in Europe, and it'll strengthen security for Turkey as well. Sorry, I got a cramp in my thigh. That's what I pushed back here. So these things happen. First time it ever happened to me in an interview, but there's a first for everything. I had a bike and running test this morning, so it might be after that, and then I'm just getting home. Sorry about that.
Just stretch. As a former swimmer, I can only recommend you that as a quite efficient way of dealing with it. But okay, let's talk European defense policy.
Sure.
Now, you also obviously have a lot of experience with that, and in March this year, the Council has formally approved the Strategic Compass, our new European strategic document, and at a time when we were witnessing already the return of war in Europe. This compass gives the European Union an ambitious plan for action, so to say, obviously to strengthen the European Union security and defense policy in the next 5 to 10 years. What are your personal what is your personal anticipation for the future of the European Union's and also NATO's common security and defense policy? We are also expecting now a very important summit in June. So what is your anticipation and assessment about the future of the common security and defense policy, and also, of course, European Union-NATO cooperation?
Sure. I read two questions into that. First one is the European side, and especially the strategic compass. I think it's a really good document, actually. And it was a long time coming. And I may also say that I think Josep Borrell and the whole European External Action Service has done a great job during this crisis and this conflict. We forget things very fast, but remember, it was a bit of a miracle that the letter that the Russians wanted an answer to address their security concerns, and Lavrov specifically said, we want the letter to be answered separately by all the 27 EU countries. Boom, Borrell coordinates it and gets one response. Strategic compass, same thing. You know, it's the first time that Europe talks the language of power. And we have to understand that in today's world, almost everything can be weaponized. So the things that were supposed to bring us together, they can also drive us apart. Energy, trade and sanctions, technology, information, social media. So these things can be used as instruments of power, even competition policy. And guess what? Europe has all of them, right? A lot of the issues that the European Union has as an exclusive competence in this new sort of geopolitical world, I call it modern geopolitics. Modern geopolitics is not about tanks and arms and guns and soldiers. It's about much more. And Europe has those tools and instruments. And I think that in many ways is what the strategic compass is all about. Then we come to the second point, which is EU and NATO. Well, there's always this talk about, either or, right? And there's this sort of, French concept of strategic autonomy versus, the transatlantic alliance. I'm, of course, simplifying. I've never seen it like that. For me, it's not either or, it's not binary, it's actually both. And what I think that the Finnish and Swedish NATO membership will do, it'll actually strengthen the European pillar in NATO. Because now we have to remember that out of the EU countries, we have everyone except Ireland, Austria, Malta, and Cyprus. I hope I didn't forget someone in NATO. And of course, we're integrating one of the biggest standing militaries in Europe, namely Finland, with one of the most sophisticated ones, namely Sweden. And with this combination, we should avoid duplication. Now, having said all of that, I still think that it's very important that Europe develops its own defense capacity. It doesn't have to be separate from NATO, but there could be a day when, Donald Trump 2.0 comes into the European Union. And if Donald Trump would say that NATO is brain dead, then we're in trouble. It's okay when the French president says it, but it's not okay when the American president says it. So, it's a careful balance, but let's work on a more European NATO. And, what the heck, you never know. Perhaps, all EU states will one day be members of NATO. Perhaps, I say.
Yeah, I was afraid that you would name those countries that are, actually outside of NATO. Being in Austria, we are not even currently having any debate on the implications. We joined together the European Union in 1995, the three neutral countries, and now there is not even a debate on our neutrality, the future of neutrality status, and also how Austria will be a credible security provider in the region and beyond, given the fact that we are now...
it's easy for me because in the olden days I couldn't have said this when I was in government, but I'd love to see Austria in NATO. I'd love to see Ireland in NATO. I'd love to see Cyprus and Malta in NATO. But of course, I'm not the one who takes the decision. And may I add, I'd love to see Iceland and Norway in the European Union as well. So, I think in today's world, to be very honest, I think it's really difficult to be neutral. I mean, what are you neutral from? And in any case, how do you define neutrality? I mean, that's why I said that Finland dropped the doctrine of neutrality and we just called ourselves a country that does not belong to a military alliance. And I guess it's a fair enough definition. But tell me, can anyone be neutral in this conflict right now? It's very binary. You have to take sides. But it's something that Austria needs to think about. And I'll just send my best regards to a very good friend of mine, Alexander Schallenberg. Get a move on it, man. I can say this because we did the Amsterdam and Nice negotiations together as young civil servants. So, and he's one of the rare breeds like me that's been both foreign minister and prime minister, or in his case, chancellor. And he was in Florence just a couple of weeks back.
And also, I was sitting with him in a public discussion just a few weeks ago, where he also said publicly that we actually are also not politically neutral. Austria is taking sides. Austria is supporting Ukraine, even though it's not delivering weapons. And in a sense, as you said, in terms of military alliances, joining
elections, if I answer too long. As things would have it, we actually published the 11th episode of my YouTube lecture series on understanding the war. And the 11th episode is about the West and the rest. So in that sense, it's a very good question. And the last one that we're going to put out, the 12th one in this particular series, is going to be about the New World Disorder. Now, the way in which I see it is that the first thing that we have to understand is that we are too Eurocentric in analyzing this war. So we're looking at it, which is understandable because it's a war that's happening in our borders. It's a shorter flight to Kiev than it is to Brussels from Helsinki, just to give you the perspective. But the rest of the world doesn't see the war like we do, and that's understandable because they are further away. We took a lot of pleasure in the idea that, we had 141 votes against Russia in the UN, 35 abstained and 4 in favor. But if we start scraping the surface a little bit, we'll understand that the 141 votes were actually scrambled together last minute, and it was a soft 1-4-1. And then if we look at the abstentions, 35 countries, but over half of the world's population, including, of course, India and China. And then when we start looking at continents, let's look at Africa. 54 countries, going to be the most populated continent by the end of the century. It says, listen, we're non-aligned. A lot of colonial powers don't come and lecture us about territorial integrity or encroaching on sovereignty. This is your war. Deal with it because it has implications on us, on the prices of food, on the prices of energy, and the prices of fertilizer. Then we go to Latin America. And there a majority of the countries are obviously standing behind Zelensky and Ukraine. But, you get in Brazil, former President Lula from the left saying this is Zelensky's fault. You get President Bolsonaro saying, this is Zelensky's fault. So, not easy. You look at reactions in India, biggest arms importer from Russia. Well, what are they going to say? They're going to be very neutral on this. But then we come to China. And on China, I think, it's quite an uncomfortable situation for Xi Jinping because he wanted to focus on domestic stuff. So he wanted to focus on two things domestically. One is zero COVID policy, which is completely absurd and is going to fail, obviously, because you can't contain a virus. So here's just a hello to all of those that 2 years ago said, China is dealing so well with this. No, they're not. They have bad vaccines. They have the biggest population in the world, and they have a virus that they cannot contain. So they're going to need Western help to survive this, but, it's a domestic affair. Then secondly, he wanted to focus on the upcoming party Congress. Now, he also can't afford Putin to lose, but for him, Russia is becoming a bit of a vassal state. 30 years ago, their economy was the same size. Now China is 10 times bigger. So China is going to oscillate between the two, but it's going to make sure that it doesn't get secondary sanctions from Europe or the world. or the US. And the reason is very simple. Business with Europe is over 800 billion per annum. Business with Russia is under 80 billion. So who do you care more about? And of course, investment, finance, banks, etc., and their link to the West is more important. What it's going to do in Russia is what it always does. It creates path dependencies or dependency. So when European sanctions bite, China is going to go in and say, well, we'll help you out on this. Don't worry, we'll fill the power vacuum. And fine, that'll give a bit of a lifeline to Putin, and but that's what China is going to do. But now we come, and sorry for the long answer, now we come to the sort of big question about the world order. My take is the following, and this is a simplification. During the Cold War, the world was ideological and bipolar. US and its allies, the Soviet Union and its allies, voluntary or not. It was capitalism, communism, it was freedom, authoritarianism. Cold War ended, NATO won it without firing a shot. The US won it with firing a few shots, I must admit. But the bottom line also, we believed in the end of history, right? We believe that all 200 nation states in the world, they're going to become, happy, lovey-dovey, peaceful, democracies, believing in social market economy and globalization. Well, this didn't happen. The world was unipolar, led by the US. But now we live in a multipolar world. And what we need to understand in the West is that there's kind of a choice here. It's about a rules-based world order or a value-based world order. Of course, in an ideal world, it would be rules-based and based on our values. But the whole concept of universal values is a hell of a lot more problematic than we think it is. I mean, I believe in them. I believe in the UN charters. But the rest of the world is looking at it. I'm simplifying. A lot of countries in the rest of the world are still seeing them as innately or inherently Western values. And this is where the problem lies. So I think the future world order will be the following. First of all, there'll be a regionalization of globalization because of the value chain disruptions with Trump, with COVID, and now the war. We understand that some of the stuff which is essential for us needs to be produced close by so that we know. Secondly, there'll probably be more regional integration. That's why I call it regional globalization. So the African Union will integrate more closely. The European Union, perhaps the European Union with the United States through TTIP or whatever, will integrate more closely. Asia will integrate more closely. And then we come to the question of what are we going to do in the West? And this is a big question. There is this sort of school of thinking that says, well, we're not going to be able to do trade with people who don't abide by human rights, fundamental rights, or liberal democracy. Well, I ask the question, who are we going to trade with then? So what I'm saying is that the age of Western dominance is reducing, and that's what we'll see. A final point, I don't for one second believe that we're going to go into a new bipolar world with a liberal world order and an authoritarian world order. The US, the European Union, and then China, Russia. It's way too simplistic. You're going to have flexible alliances with different types of groupings, moving around and doing different types of cooperation. So I would argue that the new world order will be one where no one will dominate. And one of my episodes and threads is about the 10 instruments of power. And I think there'll be different countries, different areas, different regions, different institutions that have strengths and weaknesses in all those 10 instruments. Sorry for the long answer.
But actually quite interesting one. So obviously very fluid regional constellations of
Yes.
powerful players that don't want to be caught in a binary world between United States and China, don't want to oscillate, to have more options and to trade with the one, but being a strategic partner of the other, for instance, and vice versa, which is quite of a good definition for this transitionary period. And then in the end, following this transitionary period of the international relations, we may end up with Pax Americana 2.0, given the fact that Europe is also becoming the largest combined oil and gas exporter in the world, competing now, meanwhile, with Russia on that matter, which is new. It hasn't been the case during the Cold War. And also, we don't know whether China will manage to translate this geoeconomic cloud from the last 30 years in global power projection. So there are a lot of question marks. But we need to do, as Europeans, we need to do our homework anyway, and to be also credible security provider, next to being an important, one of the most significant geoeconomic actors in the world. Would you agree with that? Okay.
I do. And I think that, as I said earlier, modern geopolitics is going to look very different from what it used to be. And Europe has a lot of strength in that. It's just a question of understanding how to do it.
But in order to do this, we will also need to do anything to help Ukraine win the war. It is very important to lead these discussions with the audience in the West, and specifically on the old continent, in the North, in the South, in Central Eastern Europe, and also in the core, specifically knowing the current debate in Germany, in France. And that means that it is important also to understand that from Ukraine's perspective, it's not about a choice between war and peace, as some debates are currently taking place in the European capitals, but it's a choice between war and subjugation.
Exactly.
Which I think is also important for the audience to understand, that it's not a choice between peace and war, it's a choice between war and subjugation, which is why Ukraine will continue the war. And for Russia, thankfully, the big miscalculations by the Russian president led to now a long war, which we also need to make sure to stop as soon as possible and provide Ukraine with all the required assistance, as you outlined in the conversation, so that Ukraine can also win against Russia. Otherwise, we will end up in a situation that will threaten the whole European security architecture.
Exactly. I fully agree.
Okay, so if you don't have anything additional to add, I would like to use the opportunity to thank you very much for your insights and your opinions. I know how precious your time is, and I don't want to keep you so long in the podcast. So follow Mr. Stubb on Twitter. He's very active on social media, and also his activities as director of the School of Transnational Governance, where you can also check on the most recent publications, his and the ones of the Institute. Thank you very much for being with me and for your insights, Professor Stubb.
Thank you very much, Velina. My pleasure.